Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Maitri Shankar, Assistant Professor of Nephrology from Institute of Nephrology, Bangalore, India. On behalf of the WINICON social media team, it's my privilege to introduce Dr. Valerie Luyckx and welcome her to this interview session. Dr. Valerie Luyckx graduated from the University of Wits, Johannesburg, South Africa, trained in internal medicine at the University of Miami and in nephrology at Harvard Medical School. She holds an MSc in public health in developing countries from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and a PhD in biomedical ethics and law from the University of Zurich. She is currently appointed in the Department of Renal Division at the Brigham and Women's Hospital, Harvard Medical School, and the Department of Pediatrics and Child Health, University of Cape Town. Her research activities include the challenges of justice and equity relating to resource allocation and management of kidney disease, and developmental programming of hypertension and kidney disease. She's a co-editor of the leading nephrology textbook, Brenner and Rector's The Kidney, and is on the editorial board of multiple nephrology journals. She's contributed as a consultant at the World Health Organization for the Global Health Ethics team. She's currently a member of the UDL Working Group and the Ethics Committee of the European Renal Association, and is Deputy Chair of the Advocacy Working Group of the ISN. She's a strong advocate for equity, diversity, and inclusion, and has a strong commitment to strengthen local capacity in nephrology and non-communicable disease care, and to improve equitable access to care everywhere. It's a privilege to have her with us at the WINICON 2023, where she would be talking about the ethics of implementation research. It's indeed an honor to welcome Dr. Valerie Luyckx to this interview session. A warm welcome to you, Dr. Valerie, ma'am.
Thank you, Maitri.
Ma'am, open access papers have drastically fewer lead authors from low-income regions than do paywall articles. Fees that journals charge to publish articles open access pose a barrier for authors in low and middle-income countries. So what measures are needed to overcome this huge publication fee barrier in open access high index journals for authors like us from developing countries?
So you're starting with a very easy question that I have a very easy answer to. Unfortunately, this is an enormous problem. I think the fees are extremely high. Most journals will say that they offer rebates and they offer waivers and things, but it's extremely hard to do. You often have to apply right at the beginning. I think we need to collectively kind of lobby. I think ideally, the problem is the higher impact journals are the ones where the research actually gets seen. And so this is why they can demand these enormous prices. But exactly as you say, most people are unable to afford these prices. Often it's even more than 1 or 2 months' salary if someone was to pay out of their pocket these article processing charges. So I think we need to engage with the journals. We need to discuss with them that it's important. They need to change their mindset that there aren't two tiers of research. There's not sort of high quality coming out of high income settings and then lower quality that's not worth considering coming out of lower income settings. What I feel is we need to start disseminating and emphasizing the quality of the research in lower income settings. And part of this, unfortunately, now has to be publishing in journals that are without article processing fees, but that do have then open access capacity. And I think, if I'm not wrong, the Indian Journal of Nephrology is open access and it's free, right?
Yes.
Similar, the African Journal of Nephrology is open access and free. These two journals are relatively sort of young. They need to have better impact factors in theory if one believes on that. But I do think that these are great places where one can, with high visibility, publish and then disseminate. And then eventually one can try to convince the community that there is good quality research coming out of lower resource settings. I very often give an example that the paper on remdesivir that came from India, that was published in Kidney International Reports, helped me to treat a patient in Switzerland. I could convince my colleagues because of a paper that came from India. So I think we need to highlight this type of work so that journals understand that these studies are worth publishing. And I think another enormous, obviously, big barrier would be to try to convince the journals to reduce the fees. They need to acknowledge they're making an enormous amount of profit, and they need to start thinking about how to restructure. So it's difficult. I think it has to be, researchers, professional societies, journals need to get together. And I think also people from lower resource settings can, as I mentioned, publish and then disseminate themselves, their own work, to raise their own profiles and the profile of their work. And then hopefully slowly this will start also to enter into people's minds that these studies are worth publishing everywhere. What I often also suggest to people is to put in the letter to the editor, I do not have funds to pay your APCs, but this is an extremely important topic. I think my research is very valuable. This is why it's valuable. And periodically, the authors actually, the editors actually, take the paper, they review the paper, and they allow to publish without a fee. And I have to say that I actually benefited from this twice from the Lancet Global Health, where they published 2 systematic reviews of ours for no fees, because none of us had any publication fees. So some journals really do try. And I think, a lot of that depends on being upfront, but also having confidence in your work when you write this letter to the editor, so that you can convince them that it's probably worth giving you a waiver if the reviewers are happy with your paper.
Thank you, ma'am. Writing letter to the editor plays a very important role here. Also, ma'am, due to the Russian-Ukrainian war, about 10,000 adults requiring dialysis in Ukraine fled their country to continue dialysis abroad. To better understand the needs of conflict-affected dialysis patients, the Renal Disaster Relief Task Force of the European Renal Association conducted a survey on the distribution, preparedness, and management of adults requiring dialysis who were displaced because of the war. You played a very important role in this survey. So what were the results of that survey, and also what policies and targeted interventions are needed to respond to the special needs of this vulnerable population during wars or any other disasters in the future?
Yeah, so thank you for this question. It's actually highly, highly topical actually for Sudan right now, where in Sudan there is an ISN task force similar to the ERA task force that's trying to support the needs. In Sudan, there are 8,000 patients on hemodialysis, for 4,500 on transplantation, and we're doing what we can to try to obtain resources for these patients, but it's extremely difficult. It was easier in Ukraine than it is for Sudan. For the Ukraine, as you mentioned, the ERA struck this task force, and the paper that you mentioned was really a survey that was led by Eva Pavlovics and Andrzej Wicek from Poland. If you might remember at the beginning, everybody thought there would be a huge sort of migration of dialysis patients from the Ukraine to all the countries around the Ukraine. The Ukraine had the privilege in a way of being somehow located next to Europe. So it's surrounded by countries which do have the capacity to take up, they were all able to scale up dialysis and meet the needs. And all the countries surrounding Ukraine had actually agreed to take over the cost. So they would provide treatment free of cost. Interestingly, although we thought these countries would be flooded, what we found in the survey, and the survey actually surveyed all the countries in Europe and got responses from many units, was that only around 600 patients left the Ukraine of these 10,000. So most patients actually elected to stay in Ukraine. However, many patients moved from the eastern part of Ukraine, where there's most fighting, from the western part of Ukraine, where there's the most fighting, to the eastern part of Ukraine. Sorry, I'm getting confused now. Just a second. They moved from near Russia to near Europe. So what is that? They moved from east to west, right?
Yeah, east to west.
I get very confused also with left and right sometimes. So they moved from eastern Ukraine to western Ukraine. So they actually relocated within Ukraine. And interestingly, the dialysis staff also moved. So the dialysis units that were in the west of Ukraine were what needed help at the beginning. They needed supplies. The dialysis companies actually also came and assisted. The WHO stepped in and assisted, provided funding to the Ministry of Health for procurement, etc. And so they did have enough supplies to dialyze the patients. And interestingly, staff that had relocated could also work in these units where patients had relocated. When there was no water and threats of electricity, there were problems. About 250 patients were converted to peritoneal dialysis in the Kiev area, because of the threats that there may not have been enough electricity and water for dialysis, etc. And to support these patients at home, we've been trying to get batteries and generators so that the APD dialysis machines could continue to function. What we also found out in the survey, we wanted to try to understand, were the patients actually prepared? Because since there's been this sort of disaster nephrology led by Mehmet Sever from Turkey, where they have lots of earthquakes, and Raymond Van Holder, who used to run the ISN, Renal Disaster Relief Task Force, there's been a big call to prepare patients to protect themselves in disasters. And so here, some of the questions that we tried to understand was, did the patients know how to protect themselves? And basically around 20 to 30% of patients arrived in the new dialysis unit in Europe without any medication records, without any dialysis prescriptions, without any sort of problem lists. Other patients had a variety of these things. So only about, I think, 16% of patients actually had all the information that was required. Patients had delays between their last dialysis and a dialysis in a European center that went from about 4 days to 12 days. And about 30% of patients arriving in the European centers from the Ukraine needed to be admitted for various things. Most of them were quite severely anemic. Some of them were quite volume overloaded. A few patients have died since then, but interestingly, several patients have actually been transplanted, interestingly. They arrived in the new country and were very rapidly put onto the transplant list, especially in Poland. What we have understood is quite a few of these patients have actually gone back since then and relocated back to the Ukraine, which is now a place of chronic conflict and not so much anymore acute conflict. But there are about 1,500 patients still missing. If one looks at the number of patients that were on dialysis initially, the 600 that we know, we think there's probably about 400 patients who relocated to Russia. And so there's still about 1,500 patients missing. We don't know where these patients are, if they might have passed away, etc. But this survey really helped us to try to understand how ready were the dialysis units in Europe to take the refugee patients, what state they were in when they arrived, what resources they needed. Because we feel that this kind of information would be helpful for future conflicts to help us prepare better to receive these patients. There were issues in terms of communication, with language, etc., in various places. And so I think this is really some lessons that we have to learn, is how better to prepare to actually receive these patients. And then also at the home units, how to prepare patients to better protect themselves when they are in transit trying to flee. At the moment in Sudan, some patients have fled from Sudan to Egypt, but basically in Sudan, there's almost no dialysis in the countries around, and definitely not free dialysis in the countries around. So very, very difficult for patients in Sudan to evacuate. And so we're really struggling there because patients at the moment in Sudan are dialyzing once a week for 2 to 3 hours. Units are dialyzing around the clock, 24 hours. They're really, really struggling, and they may only have resources for the next 1 to 2 weeks. And then we don't know what's going to happen if they don't get enough dialysis supplies. So we're pushing really, really hard. So what we've tried to do is use the network we established in the Ukraine. We got to know about all the companies, all the people to provide input and assistance. And we've connected with all those people for Sudan. It's just a lot harder to get help for Sudan. But Fresenius has actually made a small donation of some dialysis supplies. The other companies are still thinking about it. But we learned from Ukraine, and hopefully this has helped us a little bit, at least to engage a network in Sudan. But as I said, so far, we haven't really achieved much in terms of delivery of supplies. But it's interesting how quickly these conflicts are now happening one after another and affecting large numbers of patients.
Coming from developing countries, I think we should have a plan of patient preparedness in our own units and have an institutional or governmental policy on how we would deal with such disasters or situations prior, have a mock drill and things like that. We don't have any plan as such of today. So we should really work on that. There are many lessons to learn from this.
Definitely, definitely.
And moving on, you are one of the pioneers who has helped us immensely in establishing our own Women in Nephrology India wing, and you have always advocated for gender equity, and we all look up to you. You inspire many young women nephrologists, many from India. There is a pervasive bias in medicine with both men and women implicitly associating science with men. The majority of presidents of major societies such as the ISN and ESN have been men. Professorships held by women are increasing, but still only represent a quarter of the academic nephrologists. Many leading nephrology journals have predominantly male editors-in-chief, and only about 20% of deputy or associate editors are women. Women are less likely to self-promote, receive fewer major awards, and when recognized, receive less prestigious honors. So what is your experience and opinion on this aspect, and how we as women can overcome this invisible wall of gender bias?
Well, first of all, I mean, I thank you for often thanking me for supporting women in India, in nephrology in India, but honestly, I've done pretty much nothing. It's all of you. And I think you have really, all of you collectively, just massively raised the profile of all these incredible expert women in India. So I think it's fascinating because I think, as you said, there's been a sort of an old boys club in most professional societies, where in many societies they've traditionally been older and males and white, even from sort of the higher income settings. And hopefully this is changing with time, especially in a society like the ISN. It definitely needs to have a lot more global representation in the leadership. I think they are trying. I think I had the privilege of being on the executive in the ISN, and together with other colleagues, we did try to raise awareness. I think Adir 11 was also very instrumental in this type of thing. So I think one of the ways to get people even recognized in their home institutions is through associations like the ISN or WIN, putting people on the podium, getting them to speak, showing that the rest of the world is actually recognizing this person as an expert, is interested in what this lady has to say. I think women need to support each other. I think there are a lot of tips and tricks that women can give each other. And I was on a webinar at the launch of the Women in Nephrology Africa, and Professor Arpana Iyengar from Bangalore was giving an amazing tips on how to balance really home, children, work, all sorts of things. So it was really a wonderful, human exchange. I think we women need to recognize our own value, but I think we do instinctively tend to be maybe even a little more honest about our own limitations. Men often step up, even if they're not totally confident. We tend to only step up when we think we're 100 or 1,000% confident. So I think there we need to change a little bit. We need to believe that we can do things, and sometimes we learn by doing things, so you may not do it perfectly. Hopefully you do it perfectly or better the next time. I think that's all extremely important. I think there are more women now in nephrology, so hopefully there'll be more role models for others. I think one of the big sort of frustrations at the moment is when a woman very correctly receives an accolade or a prize, often now it's thought she's getting it just because she's a woman and one wants to correct the gender balance, etc. And there I feel women might be even suffering more, because the value of their prize is actually reduced because people think it's just a token prize. So I think there we have to work collectively as a society to just keep reminding people that women are getting prizes today because they are equals, or they may even be better, and that's why they deserved a prize. We need to constantly fight against this statement that, yes, well, now women are getting things because they're women and not really because they're good enough. And I think it doesn't only apply to women. I think it applies also to all forms of other people that have been minoritized. We need to think about that. But I really feel it's just interesting from outside that suddenly when one thinks of India, in the past, one used to think of one or two men, and they used to represent the entire continent in nephrology. And now suddenly there's this entire rainbow of people, and largely women, that suddenly one knows all their names and one can suggest them to write reviews and to give talks and to do webinars. So I think you as WIN India have really raised your own profile very, very competently. And a good sign, for example, in the WIN Africa, is that the men were a little bit jealous. And so that's a very, very good sign. The men were like, why are we not allowed? And why do the women have all this? So I think slowly, the men are realizing there's a value in collective action, collective supporting of each other. And I really don't think I can give you much prescription, because I think you guys have really succeeded. And I think this conference is proving that.
Definitely, ma'am. We are trying to follow your footprints. You've been a great trendsetter for all of us. Thank you, Dr. Valerie, for sharing your valuable time with us. We look forward to your session, Ethics of Implementation Research, at the WINICON 2023 to be held in Bengaluru on August 5th and 6th, 2023. It is the second annual conference of Women in Nephrology India. See you all there. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.